We wanted to use this opportunity to come together and discuss and examine more deeply the terrorist attacks in Paris, what they mean, and what we can do. Let me just say a special thanks to Catherine McMillan, who worked tirelessly and quickly over the weekend to pull all of this together. Thank you, Catherine. And a special thanks to Joe and Martha, who are, as you can imagine, are in high demand in the media today, and they've taken the most valuable thing they have, which is their time, to share their thoughts and their expertise with all of us here. Let me just also say that I know I speak for all of us when I say that our hearts go out to the victims of the Paris attacks. They now number 129, including an American student who was a student at Cal State Long Beach here in California. More than 350 people remain injured, almost 100 of them in critical condition. Now, much about the attacks we know remains unclear, and we put that out there up front. What we do know so far is that the coordinated assault on Paris on Friday was in 6 different locations. It was believed to have been conducted by 3 teams of Islamic State attackers. 7 of the attackers have died, and authorities are looking for the 8th suspect, as well as a suspected chief planner of the attack. Many questions remain unanswered and unanswerable at this point. But some of the questions that we're going to grapple with today include: what is the nature of the terrorist threat? How do we think about ISIS in comparison to Al-Qaeda? How do we think about the homegrown nature of the terrorist threat that was behind the attacks in Paris, when we already know that 5 of the 8 known attackers were French citizens, and that the attack appeared to have been orchestrated from the terrorist safe haven of Belgium, with involvement from the Islamic State? What is the role of intelligence? Was this an intelligence failure? Already conversations about the need for greater surveillance and the problems of encryption. What are the lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan about policy options to combat ISIS, either kinetically through force or ideologically through messaging? What are the geopolitical implications of these attacks? We are dealing with a rising China and aggressive Russia, concerns about NATO, European migration, not to mention Iran, North Korea, nuclear dangers in Pakistan, and a host of other challenges. How do these attacks and the response that we're now debating fit into the broader discussion of U.S. strategy and international relations? Now, everyone we know processes tragedy in their own way, but here we process tragedy by examination, by scholarship. We imagine the unimaginable, whether it's nuclear war or biosecurity or cyber threats or terrorism, and we try to make sense of senseless conflict and violence. And through scholarship, like the scholarship that Martha and Joe conduct, we hope that we learn the lessons of the past to inform the policy of the present to improve the safety and security of our world for tomorrow. I can think of no 2 better people to help us understand the events of the past few days than Martha Crenshaw and Joe Felter. Martha Crenshaw is a pioneering scholar in the study of terrorism. She's one of the world's leading experts in terrorism studies. She's currently a senior fellow here at CISAC, as many of you know, and she's a professor of political science by courtesy here at Stanford. And I have to say, here at CISAC, Martha and Chip Blacker co-run the world's best undergraduate honors program. For more than 30 years before coming to Stanford, she was the Colin and Nancy Campbell Professor of Global Issues and Democratic Thought and a professor of government at Wesleyan. She began studying terrorism before just about anybody. Her first article, The Concept of Revolutionary Terrorism, was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 1972. I know I've said this before, I'll say it again. She was 10 years old when that article was published. Since then, she's written 2 books, 5 edited volumes, and a number of articles, all at the forefront of the field. You know you're a leading thinker in a field when a publisher publishes your previously published works in a collective volume, which is exactly what Routledge did with Martha Crenshaw's work in 2011 in a book called Explaining Terrorism. Since 2005, she's been a lead investigator with the START project at the University of Maryland, which is the leading empirical studies center of terrorism. She's currently writing a book with Gary Lafree entitled Rethinking Counterterrorism, A Sensible Approach to Policy. And just a couple of weeks ago, she published with Lisa Blades, a professor in political science here at Stanford, a must-read article in The Atlantic about ISIS and the more complicated political divisions within Sunni Iraq. She's testified before Congress. She's frequently consulted with leaders in the United States and other countries about terrorism. And she has many, many honors, including receiving a Guggenheim Fellowship and just this year being awarded the International Studies Association Distinguished Scholar Award, the first woman in the history of this award to be so honored. Next to her is Dr. Joseph Felter. Joe is both a scholar and a soldier. He joined CISAC as a senior research scholar 4 years ago, and he teaches another very popular course, a sophomore college course with Scott Sagan called The Face of Battle. Joe also co-directs the Empirical Studies of Conflict project and is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He retired from the U.S. Army as a colonel following a career as a Special Forces and Foreign Area Officer with distinguished service in special operations and diplomatic assignments. He has conducted foreign, internal, defense, and security assistance missions in many places, including East and Southeast Asia, and he's had combat deployments to Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he was the lead for the International Security and Assistance Force Counterinsurgency Advisory and Assistance Team, reporting directly to Generals Stan McChrystal and David Petraeus and advising them on counterinsurgency strategy. He's had leadership positions in the Army Rangers and Special Forces and directed West Point's Combating Terrorism Center for 3 years. He's published many scholarly articles on counterinsurgency and is focused on the study of how to address the root causes of terrorism and political violence. His articles include Aid Under Fire, Development Projects and Conflict, which was recently published in the American Economic Review, and Can Hearts and Minds Be Bought? The Economics of Counterinsurgency in Iraq, co-authored in the Journal of Political Economy with Ellie Berman and Jake Shapiro. He's also been very much in the public eye in more mass audience publications. You can read about Joe's views on how to combat ISIS. We'll see if they've changed in the New York Times, Room for Debate, in which he appeared in August. So we're going to have each of them speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers and discussion with all of you. Before I turn it over to Martha, let me just have a program note, which is because we are recording this, let me ask, when you ask your questions, please wait for the microphone so that we can hear you on the videotape. And with that, I'll turn it over to Martha.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for such a generous introduction, dauntingly generous. It is true, I have studied terrorism for a long time. I'm still shocked when something like this happens. I'm not truly surprised because I'll tell you something of the history, the long history of mass casualty attacks, but I am always shocked. So sadly enough, mass casualty attacks on civilians are rare. But the bad news is that they're not unprecedented. François Hollande, responding to these attacks, said this is an unprecedented attack on France, and indeed it is in many ways. It was enormously destructive, but there are precedents. So I want to give you, to start with, something of a historical context for these types of terrorism and these types of attacks. So the willingness to kill large numbers of civilians en masse is not new, sadly enough. If we just look at post-9/11 history, we can think of numerous examples in addition to the very recent examples of Paris, Beirut, and also the Russian airliner, which I believe just this morning the Russian government said that it was a bomb that brought down the airliner, although I believe that Egypt is still denying that it was a bomb. Think of Tunisia, an attack on tourists at the Bardo Museum, attack on tourists at the beaches in a popular resort area. Think of the Westgate Mall in Nairobi in 2013. Think of the bombing of people watching the World Cup, sitting outside looking at large screens in Kampala, Uganda in 2010, left over 70 people dead. Think of Mumbai in 2008, which is often compared to the recent attacks on Paris because of the nature of coordinated urban attacks by a commando team. That killed over 160 people and wounded many more. Look at again at Europe. We all know about the 7/7 bombings in London, and of course the bombings the year previously, 2004, the train station in Madrid, which left over 191 people dead. Both of those were affiliated, by the way, with Al-Qaeda rather than ISIS, which had not yet appeared on the scene. I read among the commentaries these days some comments saying that Al-Qaeda disapproves of attacks that might kill women and children and Muslims, but I'd say that in practice this has not been the case. There have been attacks on schools in Kenya and in Pakistan, and of course there was a Boston Marathon bombing here in the U.S. But I think back even further because, as Amy said, I've been studying terrorism for quite some time, and I think of the 1980s. And well, let me start with the 1990s, and I will go back to the 1980s. The 1990s, of course, we would think almost immediately of Northern Ireland. I would think of, there was a bombing in Omagh in 1998, just a car bomb left in a crowd of people. This was the real IRA, not jihadists at all. In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing, I think most of us now remember that. Timothy McVeigh, far-right militia movement. Also in 1995, the dissemination of sarin gas in the Tokyo subways by Aum Shinrikyo, which was a Japanese cult, sort of a semi-religious with a syncretic sort of religious philosophy, would have killed many, many, many more people had they been a little bit more expert in the manufacture of the sarin gas that they used. Their intentions were extremely deadly. And of course, in 1993, there was the first bombing of the World Trade Center, which was also an attempt to bring it down. Wounded many more people, about 1,000 people. Also in the 1990s, some of us will remember waves of suicide bombings in Israeli cities, bombings of markets, buses, restaurants, beaches in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. These attacks were committed by Hamas, also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, a number of different groups, again, not jihadists. The 1980s, and one reason this almost immediately comes to my mind, I think of the mid-air bombing of Pan Am 103 in 1988, and Libya was held responsible for that, so this was an incident of state-sponsored terrorism. 2 years earlier, an Air India flight coming from Canada flying back to India, also a mid-air bombing blamed on Sikh extremists who wanted an independent Punjab. Again, willingness to kill hundreds of simply anonymous passengers on an aircraft and not jihadists at all. And of course, again, get back to the IRA, there was a bombing in Enniskillen, a Remembrance Day or Veterans Day parade, just people happening to watch the parade. Again, this was the IRA, not the real IRA, which was an offshoot of the IRA, but the IRA itself, that bombing. Again, a willingness just to kill whoever happened to be on the street at a given time. One of the first suicide attacks was in 1983. The bombing of the U.S. Marine Barracks killed 241 soldiers. Now, a number of people would say that that was not terrorism because it was a military target, but we could debate the definition of terrorism for years to come, so I won't go in that direction. But also, in 1980, there was a bombing of the Bologna railroad station in Italy. This killed something over 80 people, and it was the responsibility of the Italian far right trying to provoke a crisis that would bring the far right to power, in effect to provoke a coup d'etat in Italy. It wounded 200 people, killed 85. In general, in this period of time, the far left groups were very active in using terrorism, but they did tend to be much more discriminating in their targeting. They tended to avoid large-scale civilian casualties. But if we go back to the 1970s, we see also mass attacks on civilians. Most of these occurred in Israel, and they were the responsibility of the PLO and the other secular left-wing Palestinian groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an attack on a bus on Israel's coast, a school in Malot, and the Japanese Red Army attack on the airport at Lod, which killed mostly Puerto Rican pilgrims who were on a visit to the Holy Land. So the history of terrorist attacks that essentially they were indiscriminate in the sense that they killed whoever was there. They were discriminating in the sense that there was a target. There's never a total absence of target. We see, I think, in recent years a shift toward more coordinated attacks, such as simultaneous coordinated attacks, which we saw in Paris, also Mumbai. I think that may be attributable to better communications among these groups. It's simply ability to plan more easily, not necessarily a difference in intent. So as terrorism changed over time, a debate rose among people who studied terrorism. And I'm always reminded in this respect whenever I'm asked for my advice or described as a terrorism expert that in 2002, the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman wrote one of his columns, and he said that he was so tired of hearing about the Middle East and Afghanistan and terrorism, and that every time it came on the news, and in particular every time a terrorism expert came on the news, he switched to the Golf Channel, because at least the experts on the Golf Channel knew what they were talking about. So you will see a lot of terrorism experts on the news media these days. So a debate grew up among people who studied terrorism as to whether the sort of terrorism we were now seeing at the end of the 1990s was something entirely new and different. And sort of leading this argument that terrorism was entirely new were Steve Simon and Dan Benjamin, who recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of days ago. They were both on the National Security Council staff, and Benjamin later became the coordinator for counterterrorism in the State Department. So these were knowledgeable people. And they actually wrote most of their book before 9/11, so it was not just an automatic reaction to the 9/11 strikes. And their argument, held by others as well, was that the new terrorism was completely different from the old, that the new terrorism had apocalyptic and millenarian aims, whereas the old terrorism had more limited and reasonable aims. And as a consequence, the new terrorism was completely unlimited in terms of means. They just wanted to kill as many people as possible, whereas the old terrorists were likely to be much more discriminating, much more careful, much more limited, and not wish to kill civilians in great numbers. They used the analogy, they said the old terrorists wanted a seat at the negotiating table. The new terrorists just want to blow up the table. They don't care. They simply want to kill as many people as possible. Terrorism expert Brian Jenkins of the RAND Corporation revised an old adage that he had proposed in the 1970s when he said, terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. And he changed his mind and said, I've decided now they do want a lot of people dead. But as you can see from the examples, and they're just a few of the examples, some of the old terrorists obviously wanted a lot of people dead as well, because a lot of people dead gets the publicity that they want. Now, this debate over old versus new that I entered into on the side of there's not a profound difference between the new and the old, a lot of this argument hinged on the association between religion and terrorism, and in particular the association between Islam and terrorism, which is a very difficult, sensitive, and contentious subject to address at all. But behind a lot of the argument about the new terrorism was that the apocalyptic millenarian goals, the uncompromising goals of these groups, is due to their religious beliefs. And in many cases, Islam might not have been explicitly mentioned, but it was obvious that what people were talking about was terrorism or violence associated with religion. And actually, the idea that there was something like a religious terrorism, and it's sort of I imagine that I'm saying that in quotation marks, really grew up in the 1980s with the establishment of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and their inauguration of the tactic of suicide bombings, because it was Hezbollah in Lebanon that began the first suicide bombings. Now, by and large, Hezbollah's use of suicide tactics was more pinpointed, for example, than we see in the Paris attacks, Boston Marathon attacks, any case like this where simply someone wades into a crowd with an explosive, whether they leave it behind or they wear it on their person. And of course, part of the development of suicide tactics was the availability of technology so that you could build very miniature explosives that could be worn on the body. And it was a suicide bomber in a truck, of course, who struck the U.S. Marine barracks. Also, suicide bombers struck the U.S. Embassy not once but twice. We didn't learn the lesson of putting up barriers against would-be suicide bombers. So it was really at that time that people began talking about the relationship between religion and the idea that religious goals meant that you were willing to use extremely high levels of violence in the service of a cause. So as I noted before, a lot of these mass casualty attacks were committed by groups that had nothing to do with religion whatsoever. And it's also the case that suicide attacks, which are now the hallmark of jihadist groups, both al-Qaeda and ISIS and their affiliates and associates. But initially, although they began with Hezbollah in Lebanon, they were really perfected by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka. It was this group, again, no religious connection whatsoever, that actually perfected the kind of vests and belts that now we see used by jihadists and that were later used by Palestinians in the 1990s. So initially, when the suicide attacks began, those of us studying it, a number of people argued that the reason for this had to do with the Shia emphasis placed on the value of martyrdom, and that this was why Shia groups such as Hezbollah would use suicide attacks. That argument was quickly undermined not only by the Tamils, but by the fact that the groups that subsequently picked up the tactic and now are using it extensively are Sunni groups. And interestingly enough, in Iraq and other conflict theaters, Shia groups never use suicide tactics. It's exclusively Sunni groups. So it's certainly not anything to do with the Shia faith, since they provide a lot of the targets for suicide attacks. So this is a very contentious subject, and particularly in the United States, where the Obama administration has been criticized for failing to be very explicit and direct about an association between Islam and terrorism, for referring generically to violent extremism. At the same time, sort of from another direction, the administration has been criticized, and the press criticized for that matter, for placing such emphasis on jihadist terrorism when many more people have been killed by right-wing terrorism in the United States than by jihadist terrorism, which is true. It's usually not even considered terrorism. When the Department of Homeland Security issued a report pointing to the danger posed by far-right groups, they got soundly criticized in the media and in Congress for pointing this out. So I actually have a research project where we've coded plots in the U.S. against the U.S. homeland. And we just looked at jihadist plots. And we went back to 1993, the date of the first bombing of the World Trade Center. So we're looking at plots. They didn't have to come off. This is just the plots that we could discover. And I think that we probably have a pretty good count. So what we have is, since 1993 and up through this past July, 101 plots. Well, that's over more than 20 years, only 100 plots. And a lot of these plots were not extremely serious. They did not involve very many people. Typically, plots in the United States have not involved as many people as European plots, because we've also coded all plots against the homelands of NATO, EU, Australia, and New Zealand countries. So plots in Europe have tended to involve a much larger number of individuals, and they have been genuinely transnational, as you see in the Paris plot coming from Belgium and from within France. In the U.S., they are much more likely to be homegrown. We found among U.S. would-be perpetrators and perpetrators only 3 people who could be considered to be returned foreign fighters, that is, having actually engaged in combat. We did, however, find that of the perpetrators we could get information on, about a quarter of them had trained abroad. So it's still, this is a problem. So this is not totally a homegrown phenomenon for the United States. We have something like around maybe 200 perpetrators and would-be perpetrators in the United States. So I want to conclude shortly, and I'll just sort of conclude by mentioning what does history tell us about the response to terrorism. Since the 1970s, the U.S., maybe the U.S. a little belatedly, but certainly in Europe and picking up steam in the 1980s and 1990s, extensive reforms of intelligence, police, and security bureaucracies within European countries and to a certain extent within the U.S. in the sense of producing greater centralization and greater coordination within the bureaucratic apparatus. You can look at Germany, look at Great Britain, look at France, look at Italy, and see that over time there's been quite a lot of reform in these areas. One lesson, last lesson that I think we should draw from our own response to 9/11 is, of course, it's been good police and intelligence work that's prevented these plots from coming off in most cases, but also a cautionary tale. We took a lot of very strong measures in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, indeed in just a month or two or three after 9/11. And it proved, first, very difficult to reverse those measures. I think you all know that from following the history, say, of the Patriot Act. Very, very difficult to reverse the measures, even if you know about the measures. And second, when you've adopted all this legislation, measures in great haste, they're very expansive, I think it makes it difficult to adapt to a changing terrorist threat. And the terrorist threat is changing, but we have laws that mostly focus on preventing immigration and sealing borders. We don't have laws that can deal with social media that contributes to inspiring people who are residents of your country, citizens of your country, from committing acts of violence in response to an ideological appeal that you really cannot stop. You can try to stop the source, like assassinating Anwar al-Awlaki, but you can't really stop the appeal. And this is, I think, one of the key elements of the response that we have not mastered and that the French also will need to master, that will have to be at the forefront of any response to terrorism. So now I'll turn it over to someone who really is an expert on the response to terrorism, Joe Felter.
Well, thanks, Martha. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you, Amy, for this invitation. It's a bit daunting to be talking on the topic of terrorism with Martha Crenshaw, who's, I think, informed all of our understanding of the topic, and it's certainly a real honor to be here with you, Martha. And also thanks to Amy and Dave for continuing this great legacy at CISAC, where we can have these kind of exchanges. And much of my understanding of terrorism and these topics since transition from the military have been informed by just the amazing environment that you cultivate here, Amy. So thank you, and CISAC. It might be hard to come up with some reasons for optimism in the aftermath of these attacks, but what I'd like to do is, with that historical context and overview that Martha described, which is worth a one-quarter course, I think. We heard the whole expanse here. I'd like to focus a little bit on some of the challenges and opportunities from maybe the operational level and maybe even the tactical level, and start out with describing some of the reasons why we might be optimistic about the way ahead with ISIS, highlight some of the real concerns, and then provide look at some of the response options in particular and some of the pros and cons of each to provide some context for the following discussion. Okay, so optimism, and again, this is a tough topic, tough to be too optimistic post-Paris, but in reality, I think ISIS is very challenged militarily. It is, it's losing the fight in Iraq and in some ways in Syria. I think they've lost over 25% of the territory they controlled from the high water mark from its peak. It's lost control of key cities like Tikrit, Sinjar, and Tal Afar. So in many ways, they are losing on the ground. They have limited manpower. There's been various estimates of their numbers, but their so-called caliphate at one time was as big as, I think, the area of Great Britain. Mm-hmm. That's a big area for 30,000 plus fighters to operate in and to defend. If you need to defend in one area and attack in another area, they're just not able to do it. So a limited manpower mobility, I think, is going to challenge ISIS in their self-proclaimed caliphate. And also, they really have no real allies in Iraq and Syria. You think about it, the government of Iraq, no. The Kurdish forces, regional government in Iraq, absolutely not. Syrian Kurds, our own coalition forces, Al-Qaeda, Assad, Shia militias, Iran, they're in a tough neighborhood and no one really likes them. So they're not exactly welcome in their own self-proclaimed home turf. And I would argue also, and this is in contrast to Al-Qaeda, their strategy is very much, and even their operations and attacks, I think it is constrained by their own self-proclaimed ideology. If you read, there's some great piece by Graham Greene, I think some of you may have seen in The Atlantic, and it's worth a reread, what does ISIS really want? And in his words, or in others that have described it, the caliph really must maintain territory. This is different than Al-Qaeda. So he's got to have this territory to enforce Islamic law. And once this caliphate is established, they're obliged to wage war to expand the caliphate. It's the essential duty of the caliph, of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in this case. And this is pretty tough. So I think the appeal of ISIS and its legitimacy really rests on communicating to its crew, hey, we've established the caliphate and it's growing. So to occupy and govern territory is pretty challenging. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has a pretty tall order on his hands. So given that ISIS is obliged to maintain its state and expand the caliphate, it's got to fight. And in many cases, it has to fight symmetrically. And this is pretty tough for an organization like ISIS, where it would be much more effective fighting asymmetrically, like we've seen, the Taliban in Afghanistan, if you will. So if you fight symmetrically toe-to-toe with more powerful enemies, it's pretty hard to be successful. If you have to pick fights with with groups like the Iraqi Kurds because you've got to expand your caliphate, you're going to have challenges. Its ideology demands it continues to expand, and this is going to expose its vulnerabilities even more. Obviously, a much more optimal response for an organization with I'll call military forces like ISIS is to fight asymmetrically. Avoid direct engagements, hide among the population, use guerrilla-style tactics. But because of their self-proclaimed objectives to expand territory, they're forced to fight maybe suboptimally in a symmetric way. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for them going forward. You look at the Taliban post-U.S. 2001 invasion. Imagine if they tried to hold on to a piece of Kandahar and govern it. They would have been crushed, right? But they very effectively receded into the population across the border and fought what some would argue a pretty effective counterinsurgency or insurgency and an asymmetric campaign with sadly for those of us who've confronted them with great success. So again, that's going to be a challenge for them. So that's some room for optimism from an operational tactical standpoint. ISIS is going to have a hard time achieving their objectives, expanding their caliphate, governing territory, based on the fact that they're going to have to fight almost toe-to-toe with much more powerful enemies in some cases. So let's talk about some concerns, some general concerns. So ironically, and I think disturbingly, the attrition of ISIS and the rolling back of its territorial expansion really increases its incentives to conduct attacks like we've seen in Paris, in Lebanon, and downing of the Russian airliner. So as a result of their weakness, we're seeing these efforts to attack outside of the borders. A good friend of Martha and mine, Will McCants, who I worked with at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, wrote a great book on ISIS, and he makes a point that the Paris attacks are really a sign of weakness of ISIS. If they can't defeat their enemies in Syria and Iraq, let's hit them at home and deter them from attacking us in Iraq. This doesn't make the mourning families of the victims of Paris feel any better that this is a sign of weakness, but it is an interesting sign of their weakness. So when ISIS attacks against, again, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Russian airline in Paris, I think they show us that if you're fighting against ISIS and its interests in Syria and Iraq, they're going to attack you at home or your interests abroad. And whether this creates more resolve amongst states like France or capitulation, that remains to be seen. And another reason for concern, its capacity for centralized planning and decentralized execution by homegrown terrorists. This capacity is really difficult to defend against. Again, think about it. This was ISIS Central, directed it from the caliphate, and it was carried out by homegrown terrorists in France, and that's pretty disturbing. A colleague of all of ours, and known to many of you, Jake Shapiro, who was a former CISAC affiliate, has written extensively on the trade-offs between security control that terrorists must make. And that implies that the terrorist leadership really wants to control their subordinates, if you will, their agents as principals. But in this case, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he can provide what I would call as a military guy, commander's intent. You go out there and wreak havoc, create casualties, bring death and destruction abroad. there's some pretty clear commander's intent. Now run with it. If you can do that with a long leash, it allows you to be pretty effective. I think I worked in Joint Special Operations Command with General McChrystal, and he was famously known for saying you need to decentralize to the point of discomfort. And by doing that, you're able to get the maximum out of your organization. I think Baghdadi in this case is doing the same thing. He's saying, hey, go out there and kill folks in the West, wreak havoc. But then he's turning the actual execution over to these homegrown terrorists that are really hard to defend against, because they don't really offer law enforcement and other security and intelligence agencies the opportunity to interdict them. It's greatly constrained when, again, using Jake Shapiro's work, they're not required to exercise a lot of control over their agents, if you will, and that makes it especially challenging. And the last major concern, and see what my time is, I may go into more detail with this in question and answer, but this is a war of ideas at many levels, and Martha mentioned this. And in a war of ideas, this war of ideas, I would say we still don't know the nature of our enemy in many ways. Sun Tzu famously says, you got to know your enemy first and foremost. I did some Senate testimony when I was the director of West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, and not to be self-promoting, but my one line that got picked up in the media was that you can't capture, kill, or incarcerate an idea. As a military guy, we're always focused on putting the warhead in the forehead of that bad guy, right? But the ideas live on. We can kill any number of these terrorist leaders, but their ideas live on. I'm certainly all about taking these terrorists off the map, but we must appreciate that in this fight, it is a war of ideas, and these ideas live on. And at a minimum, we have to understand what these ideas are if we're going to combat them. There's a great, I think, a good analogy, not an apples-to-apples analogy, but I think we eventually prevailed in the Cold War because we made concerted efforts to understand the nature of the ideology that we were confronting then. And I argue that even we have some undergrads here, some people close to undergrads, young people. If I flashed a picture, and some of you I've lectured in class, if I flashed a picture of the thought leaders of communism, Marx, Engels, Stalin, Mao, Che Guevara, you probably recognize their picture, right? You may even have a T-shirt with one of them on it, right? But if I flashed a picture, as I've done in class, of the equivalent of the thought leaders of extremist Islam, and there's many words for it, I argue that you wouldn't know what Sayyid Qutb looks like what Abdullah Azzam looks like, Abu Bashir al-Tartusi, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, Abu Musab al-Suri. These are the giants in these extremist Islam. These individuals, if you read their writings, they're providing the playbook for some of these extremist activities, and we don't even know largely who they are or what they're saying. So this is a challenge. I would say we are grossly underprepared. I hope this comes out more in Q&A, to fight a war of ideas when we don't even know what these ideas are about, and they're out there, and shame on us for waiting for a tragedy to have this kind of wake-up call. So let me finish with a discussion of a few of the challenges and concerns with some of the responses that have been floated out there. Hey, you've just lost 130 people. Whether you're in France or even in the United States, there's a natural reaction. Hey, we got to lay the hammer down, right? Let's go out and bomb them. And certainly we've got this incredible capability. Let's bomb ISIS. I won't paraphrase some presidential candidates, which may be a little bit extreme, but it's a natural tendency to want to lash out, and we appreciate that. But the truth is, it's just not really an option. This option is very much constrained. It's fundamentally a targeting challenge. ISIS is occupying urban areas. Unless we want some kind of Dresden-level campaign where we just level cities and accept huge amounts of civilian casualties, bombing is going to be very difficult to do. If ISIS decides to launch an attack and masses a formation, by all means, let's maintain the vigilance and have the capacity to interdict them with a targeted bombing campaign. But understand that ISIS will adapt if we launch a huge bombing campaign. And there's folks here like Admiral Ellis and others that are a lot more experienced with this, having directed these types of campaigns. But I would argue let's caution our optimism of what an increase in bombing just might do. Because in many ways, it also, more dead Muslim women and children, social media, propaganda, it just plays right into the jihadis' hands as well. So bombing has its limitations. And I would recommend a New York Times op-ed for you if you want to read about that I put out a while ago. So increasing ground forces. I do believe that some increase in ground forces are called for, but we need to be smart about this. I have a special operations, special forces background. Ideally, we could go send advisors in there to work with partners on the ground. and build their capacity. But the truth is we are limited with our credible partners on the ground, and this is a challenge. Some of our special operations forces, who we call the Black Soft folks, the folks that did that amazing prison raid a few weeks ago, where we sadly lost one of our operators from that organization formerly known as Delta Force. They're doing good work, and they're going to continue to do good work. But a big occupation force, that if we send in a large number of ground forces, that comes with some risks. And again, that plays right into the narrative some of our jihadists, and I'm going to use jihadists, and I apologize if that's offensive to some people, to some of the jihadists. With a large group of Americans, and this is what Abu Musab al-Suri, who wrote, prolific writer, he said this is exactly what he wanted. He wanted to bring Americans, and hopefully they would occupy Muslim lands, because what happens with a lot of Americans there? All the casualties and all the results of the conflict are often blamed on them, and it plays right into the jihadi narrative and feeds their propaganda, stokes their recruiting abroad. There's a lot of risk there. And again, I'm not saying there isn't a role for increasing ground forces, but we need to appreciate the downside risk of a huge increase in ground forces. And also, if ISIS retreats into these urban areas that it maintains, and I know we've got some active duty military folks here, I see John back there, urban combat is hard, it's ugly, it's nasty. My friends that have commanded units in Fallujah, it's the 10-year anniversary of it right now, they say it's like playing tackle football in a hallway. I mean, it's really hard, and it's very difficult to avoid casualties. It's very difficult to leverage your comparative advantages when it comes to technology and firepower. It is a gunfight, it's room to room. It's nasty, and you're going to lose people, and it's very difficult to root someone out of an urban area over time, and that's the kind of fight I would argue it might end up being. If you actually want to root out ISIS from some of their strong points, they're going to eventually retreat in some of these urban areas where they can't be targeted, and where it will require an enormous investment of blood and treasure on the part of the U.S. and the coalition. So that's a challenge. All that said, I think the Paris attacks, and certainly Lebanon and the Russian down airliner to some degree, it's got to be a wake-up call for the coalition, at least to contribute to the effort once we decide what a better response is. I do think we need to take the gloves off in some respects. I think our advisors on the ground are a bit constrained. That will, of course, come with some corresponding casualties. We may consider more aggressive efforts, but I think we do need to balance them with the downside risk of a huge U.S. military presence over there. Because sadly, I've done some of my own academic research. Civilian casualties, whether it's caused by ISIS or the U.S. or coalition, they're blamed on the U.S. Even if it's a coalition blamed, when I was in Afghanistan, if the Germans did it, if the French did it, if the Italians did it, it was the U.S.'s fault. And even if the Taliban did it, it was the U.S.'s fault for being there in the first place. And I think we may see that same dynamic here in Iraq and Syria as we go in. We're going to own a lot of the collateral damage, like it or not, but whether we're responsible for it or not, and that's a challenge. So I guess I have a lot more I can but I'll save them for Q&A. But I don't think there's a unilateral military solution. I think U.S.-led military efforts are an important component. I would say they're a necessary but not sufficient component. I think we need a decisive response where we can right now, but we need to maintain vigilance over time. And Martha mentioned this, and that's going to be in the realm of law enforcement and intelligence. Some of the areas that Amy's a leading expert on. We need to appreciate that the front lines may not be in Raqqa. That they may be in capital cities or places in the West, or God forbid it's in America. But that we need to be prepared for that possibility as well. So it's a multi-front fight. There's a military term called key terrain. You always want to go after the key terrain, and that's often defined in terms of a hill, a city, something like that. I would argue, and this is going back to the point I made earlier about the ideology, the key terrain in this fight, it may be the 6 inches between the ears of these would-be jihadi recruits. And we, as far as we need to continue to address the symptoms of this threat, we need to go back and look at the root causes. What is motivating these individuals to leave these lives of privilege in some cases and go to these places and maybe travel to Iraq and Syria and blow themselves up, or walk outside their home in Europe or potentially the United States and participate in these self-directed attacks. And that's a really tall order that's going to require a whole lot of cooperation across the interagency and across our partner nations abroad. So I'll leave you on a not very optimistic note, but with that, I'll save some of my remaining points for Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thanks to both of you for putting so much on the table for all of us. Let me, if I can, just take the moderator's prerogative to ask one question before we open up to everybody else, which is there's been a lot of discussion in the press about the terrorist threat from the Syrian civil war in Europe versus the United States. how do you think about the vulnerabilities of the United States versus Western Europe?
I can take a
Sure.
So if you want to start with that. Well, and I've read a lot recently, like all of us, so if I miss it, this is probably informed by someone that I just read. But I think we are less at risk than Europe. Certainly we need to maintain vigilance. I think if you look at Paris, the attacks, it depended on a number of things. I think the attackers had easy access to Paris. It was pretty easy to get across from Belgium. A lot of them were homegrown. They just had to walk down the street. This is a very sensitive thing to try to describe, but I'll try to do it maybe in a patriotic way. Those of you who know me, I'm a patriotic guy. I think the United States does a little better job with assimilating its immigrants to include Muslim community. I think that individuals in the at-risk demographics in France and other places in Europe may be a little more inclined to lash out at their own countrymen. And I'm sorry if that's offensive to anyone. There is a certain infrastructure in Europe, we'll call it a Euro jihadist infrastructure that I think exists that we don't see something similar in the United States. And I think the security agencies in Europe aren't as sophisticated as the United States. We had a big wake-up call after 9/11, and we didn't spend all our money wisely, but we invested heavily in improving our security infrastructure, our breaking down some of the stovepipes that prevented some of the collaboration and information sharing across agencies that are so important in this kind of fight. I mean, the front line, when I was at West Point as directing this terrorism center, when I would talk to the FBI, these joint terrorism task forces, or state and local law enforcement agencies, they are the tip of the spear. I mean, the U.S. military, we're out trying to catch them early, but the tip of the spear, the end of the line, are these intelligence agencies, these law enforcement agencies, these folks, the individuals from Homeland Security. And I don't think that's as developed in Europe. And I think they need to make the investments. And sadly, maybe it took this kind of an attack. Let's hope this is enough to be the same catalyst I think we had after 9/11. So we have to be vigilant in the United States, but I do think Europe is more at risk, and let's hope that they can close that gap and that we can still defend and deter an attack in our own country.
I guess I agree with you partially, Joe. I agree that they're much more at risk than we are, and reason being porousness of internal borders. Once you're in the Schengen agreement zone, as you know, there are no border controls, so you cross from Belgium to France without any sort of check at all. And what we're seeing now is some people rethinking the Schengen agreement and wanting to reinforce some sort of border controls. And the British have always had border controls. You don't have to, as a member of the EU, you don't have to participate in the Schengen arrangement where you can cross from one country to another. They also, particularly the French, have a much larger Muslim minority. Close to 10% of the French population is probably Muslim. And in terms of Muslim minorities in different countries, they come from different parts of the world. They're very different. There's not sort of one generic Muslim minority in European countries or in the U.S. So the composition is really extremely different, for example, between Britain, France, Belgium, and different areas within these countries. So the area of Brussels that these networks are centered in is mostly Moroccan immigrants. And of course, some of the people who were responsible for these attacks were actually French citizens living in Belgium. Also, you see in the popular commentary on this that it's very difficult to get weapons in Europe, and so how could this have happened that they were able to get Kalashnikovs? But it turns out it's really not that hard to get weapons in Europe, and particularly to buy them in Belgium and to bring them into France. So that really was not a barrier here. In the United States, we typically think that we have a very tiny Muslim minority. It tends to be a minority that comes from a lot of different countries around the world. It's not all from one country. It's not like Britain and Pakistani immigrants. And our Muslim citizens tend to be quite well off. They are prosperous doctors, lawyers. There's a social class and economic difference there as well. Thus, for all these reasons, you have many, many more people going to Syria to fight, particularly from France, but also Belgium, proportional to its population, more from Belgium than any other country, a lot from Britain, thousands, whereas in the U.S., the last figure I read was maybe 100. And as I've said, in our data, we just so far returned foreign fighters have just not been a problem for us. And clearly, they are for Europe. In part, again, that's geography. It's just easier to get from Europe to Turkey and get into Syria than it is from here. Although I think that in terms of responding to terrorism, I'm not sure I would agree totally with Joe. I think that European countries, and the French in particular, have had a lot of experience with terrorism. And actually, I just want to mention that one of our former CISAC fellows wrote a book about British and French counterterrorism while he was here at CISAC, Frank Foley, who teaches at King's College London these days. And the French have recently reorganized their intelligence services. So I think they're trying hard to deal with terrorism, but I think the problem is bigger for them than it is for us right now. It's simply too easy for people to mount these types of attacks. It's just not that difficult for them.
So why don't we open up for questions?
My question is about the actual links between ISIS and the perpetrators of the attacks. We know that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and other ISIS ideologues have called for attacks, and we know that these individuals carried out the attack. But what do we know in terms of if there was any training or more direct instructions? And if these links are more tenuous, is it helpful or maybe even counterproductive to call this an ISIS attack?
Well, I'll just offer a remark. One, of course, is that, as I think Amy said in introducing this session, there's still a lot we don't know, and there's probably quite a lot that we won't know. So I think we're all at the mercy of what's been reported in the press, which I've tried to follow as closely as possible and followed the French press. So my understanding is that there are reliable reports that there were communications between these teams, three teams, and Raqqa, that those were intercepted. Or something that maybe the significance of it was not recognized at the time, but belatedly, which is often the case, you discover that people you were sort of semi-watching actually turned out to be the dangerous ones. And also the fact that 4 or 5 of the perpetrators had traveled to Syria and come back. So I think that's the evidence, as well as the claim by ISIS that they were behind it. Also, I would point to the fact that when the press was still reporting 7 assailants, ISIS said there were 8, and they were right, there were 8.
I think there can be varying degrees of let's call it ISIS central involvement, but as we've seen, I think a real risk is, we'll have copycat attacks, we'll have returning foreign fighters who fought for ISIS, where you could draw links there, but I think a real challenge is there. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi can just say, go out and attack, and I think with that big mandate, that alone is going to be enough of an involvement to inspire individuals to attack in the name of ISIS, which is going to be hard to defend against.
Norman Amark. I'm here at CISAC and in the history department. And I was very struck, Martha, again by, let me just say it was a wonderful pair of presentations and very informative and sane and helpful in understanding what goes on. I mean, the one thing that you mentioned that always strikes me in these kinds of episodes is the importance of the reaction to terrorism. In other words, almost as important as the act itself is how governments and societies respond. And that tends to be what the terrorists are looking for in the first place. So it's an integral part of the act. And there's always an over-response, as you know from this historical rendition that you gave us. And you can actually, as you know, trace it back to the 19th century where, governments undermine their own stability in reacting to terrorism routinely, and however you interpret the Patriot Act, there are different ways to do it, but in some senses, that's what you're arguing. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, how do you factor this into the algebra of studying terrorism? How do you control, in some fashion, the extreme reaction? This didn't happen in the United States. It could have. Mm-hmm. I mean, it could have, right? I don't think that's excluded. And then we would know, better in our own midst how to deal with this. But it would be an extreme reaction if you just imagine for a second that this happened in this country. And in France, this is going on now in Europe. And so the whole refugee problem, for example, from Syria is now going to be totally recast in a way that may actually be quite negative both for the situation in Syria and Europe. So I guess my question is, how do you figure this in? How does he include this in the in the, in the algebra of terrorism?
Well, you're quite right, and it's usually the reaction to terrorism that has more lasting consequences than the act of terrorism itself, invariably, I might say. And I would say that you see it happening already in the United States, even though it didn't happen here, extreme politicization of the issue. Candidates immediately has to happen in the middle of a presidential campaign. Indeed, we always seem to be in the middle of a presidential campaign. So how can I say that it could happen and we wouldn't be in the middle of one? But immediately everybody leaping opportunistically onto this issue to try to promote their favorite measures that they think we should take, send more ground troops, cut off refugees. And the immediate reaction of saying, well, it was refugees, when the only evidence is a stolen passport that might have been used by one of these individuals, and where otherwise we have no evidence that any of these refugees or immigrants are affiliated with ISIS. It could be, but we have in other words, very slight piece of evidence here. How to avoid that, and I really don't know except to say that this is really very common. I even edited a book on the consequences of counterterrorism, that this is a more serious consequence for you. And I think that two things could be improved that might help. One is more contingency planning, so that when something like this does happen, the government already has thought of a way of responding. And I've mentioned this to people in government, and government then is accused of using the crisis to implement measures that they already had in mind. But the other side of that is that if you don't have something in mind when something happens, then you're just throwing it open and you're getting pushed into doing things that take you far beyond what you really wanted to do. And the second is, we don't really have a very good way of measuring the effectiveness of counterterrorism. Not in academia and not in the government, not in any way. We have various metrics like numbers of people killed in drone strikes. That tells us nothing about the effect on their ideas and on their narratives. So I think if we could plan in advance more carefully about how we'll respond. And then of course you have to be a leader who's willing to hold the line. And now we have Obama, who's at the end of his second term. So he perhaps will respond more calmly than a president would in a different position in terms of their tenure in office. But I think it's very difficult to resist the pressure to overreact. And I'm not sure that it's really a pressure from public opinion. I think it's more of a pressure from politicians. But I'll let Joe speak to that as well.
I think you hit it. I will just add to that. Again, let's remember that jihadi narrative, if you will. We've got to recall sometimes this overreaction is exactly what plays into their hands. So I think there needs to be a response, but that needs to be measured by, wow, and especially in the age of social media and the type of technology-empowered propaganda that they can use, the persecution of Muslims and those types of things can be turned against us. So we just need to factor that in how we respond. That's by no means saying that there shouldn't be a decisive response, but it's an added factor to consider.
Nina Silov, I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CISAC. I have a slightly more specific take on the previous question, and that is, what does the Islamic State calculate are the benefits of such attacks, and could the strategy and response be tailored specifically to deny the Islamic State those benefits?
You want to try that?
Well, I go back to the jihadi ideologues. There's a great influential piece called that Abu Bakr Naji wrote called "The Management of Savagery," which is really a playbook for what ISIS is doing in many respects. They absolutely want these zones of savagery. They want chaos. They want huge attacks. And this is how they fill the void. So again, they absolutely benefit as far as how they see the way to achieve their objectives by creating this chaos that these types of attacks bring. So this is very much consistent with their interests, because then they go ahead and fill that void. They want a civil war within Islam, which is explicitly in Abu Bakr Naji's book. So I would say yes, this is in their interest. Martha, I don't know if you have a...
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that might be one of the arguments one could use to persuade leaders not to indulge in overreactions, that you're simply playing into their hands by doing that. We don't ever know exactly, I don't think, what they want tactically. We get more information over time in terms of what they might want from a specific attack. But I think that Joe's absolutely right, that if we committed ground troops, they would be delighted, many of them. Now, for them, there's a risk if our overreaction might totally destroy their ostensible caliphate. It would, certainly. We could destroy it, obviously, if we're willing to pay the cost. I don't know. They may be, this is an old strategy among terrorist groups. They know that democracies is a limit beyond which they won't go. They'll go so far but no further. And they may be banking on that as well, that there will be an overreaction, but it won't be to the extent of completely wiping out the caliphate entirely, or what they call the caliphate. I don't want to say myself that I think that it is a caliphate.
Martha, can you follow up with that? Because I know you've written a lot about that it's a more complicated dynamic among terrorist groups than most people typically imagine. If we go after the Islamic State, what are the likely effects, cascading effects on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and other groups?
Well, that's a very good question, and yes, I've done a lot of research on the relationships among militant groups, and those of you who don't already know about it, I have a website called mappingmilitants.stanford.edu. If we just focus on the Islamic State, does that mean we're not going to focus on the al-Nusra Front in Syria, which is actually an ally of Al-Qaeda Central? Does it mean we're not going to focus on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also another official Al-Qaeda affiliate? We'll only be opening the door for them, and just to remember that among groups that have been responsible for plots in the U.S., Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is at the top of the list. They have tried hard to attack the U.S., tried to blow up, remember the famous Christmas Day bomber, tried to blow up an airliner flying into Detroit, tried to put bombs in printer cartridges. They've been very active, so they are rivals of ISIS. In the Syrian theater, you have a very interesting dynamic whereby we might think that among all these different competing groups, and there are many different Islamist-oriented groups in Syria, it's not just ISIS and the al-Nusra Front. There are up to 20 smaller groups, many of which are frankly not very moderate at all. So what's going to happen to them? We could destroy ISIS, presumably, and its deprive it of its territory, but you're going to have these groups still out there. And without ISIS as a rival, some of them might grow in power, particularly the al-Nusra Front. In other words, the kinds of people who are being recruited into ISIS would just be recruited possibly into another group. And we get back to what Joe said earlier, that unless you can deal with the ideology and with the narrative and with recruits who are very attracted to these ideas, the organizational forms can be extremely varied. And I must say that when I've written about this, I tend to get a lot of criticism, because a lot of people would prefer to believe that there's a monolithic Islamist conspiracy out there with only one center, when the truth of the matter is that there's still multiple centers.
Herb Lynn, CISAC. Both of you have emphasized the idea that ISIS is more an idea than anything else, that they have an ideology that needs to be fought and so on. And yet, when you talk about their ideology in terms of actually establishing a caliphate and so on, I don't see what a compelling counter-narrative could possibly be. If either of you would care to speculate on what that counter-narrative might possibly be, I think I'd certainly be interested in hearing that.
Great and tough question, Herb, as always. So I'll speak to a portion of that, and one is maybe tactics. Maybe the romantic appeal of the caliphate will be hard to have to counter among some groups, but what I think you can address is the notion that the mass killing of Muslim innocents, women and children, is sanctioned by the Quran, and you can still become a martyr, and all the trappings of martyrdom, you will still receive that. So there's sharp disagreements within even extremist jihadi Salafist clerics, if you will, who may share the same beliefs that the most hardcore ISIS fighter does about America and Israel and women's rights, but they will differ on an important dimension, that is stopping short of sanctioning mass killing of innocents. And those arguments are being made by these extremist Salafist clerics in Friday sermons. It's somewhat finding that that's a narrative you want to try to identify amplify and hope will resonate with these would-be jihadists. So they may still want a caliphate, but getting there, the means to get there does not include mass atrocities and killings of innocents. So that's one opportunity. The romantic appeal of the caliphate, that's another one. Maybe they can keep that in the long-range plans, but how you get there, we can address the tactics that are sanctioned by the Quran by using their own arguments from within these communities.
Well, I think what most people would answer is that, yes, that's absolutely essential. And they'd agree with you that we've not come up with a very good counter-narrative. And just the whole idea that we should come up with a counter-narrative. We don't have a narrative. We have to come up with one on the spot in reaction to their narrative. That's sort of distressing. But Joe's right. There are a lot of splits within the overall Salafist, never mind among Muslim thinkers, but even within the sort of narrow Salafist community. And some of the people who were extremely radical and were some of the major influential thinkers have now turned against ISIS, which explicitly justifies practices such as slavery in its English language magazine. So I think at least just in terms of U.S. policy, we ought to have a greater understanding of their writings, and I know Joe and I agree entirely on this. We ought to publicize the things that they say, not make it hard for people to get their documents, make it easy for people to get their documents. They talk exactly about what they're about their treatment of minorities. They justify killing Christian Yazidis in Iraq. They don't make any bones about it. It's not like they're trying to disguise the fact that they think that they're thoroughly justified in exterminating Shia, for example. I think we need to publicize these sorts of practices and ideas on their part. And then what people will always say is, how can it come from us? It's got to come from Muslims who will have credibility. And there's a lot going on there that we don't understand, and part of it is a very organizationally diffuse faith in which there are no leaders. And in fact, that anybody can get up and say, I'm an imam, a Salafist imam. And it's both in the realm of ideas and in the realm of who controls the mosques, particularly in Europe. And now we'll get back to the role of Saudi Arabia, because the ideas behind Wahhabism are not very different at all from the ideas behind ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the Saudis have been funding mosques all over the world, including Pakistan, Mali, which is traditionally a very easygoing, moderate sort of place, and in Europe, Spain, France, Belgium, England. And the authorities have allowed radical imams to take over these mosques. And I hear this all the time from police in Europe that they can't do anything about it. And I'm all for freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But one of the first things they do is discourage girls from going to school, discourage people from sending their daughters to school, because, and you could deal with those sorts of practices. You could publicize it, and you need people to speak up against it.
My name is Joseph Turigian. I'm a pre-doc at CISAC. It seems to me that the groups that are best at fighting ISIS are the Shia in Iraq and the Kurds and the Alawite regime, but that they're not very good at projecting power into the heartland where ISIS is. And even though the United States can use air power to push back on the periphery, we don't really have an answer of whose boots are going to be or that are going to march into Raqqa and destroy this regime. So I'm wondering if there's any concern that we've fallen into a holding pattern where, because we're involved with the airstrikes, we've made ourselves their enemy, and because we frustrated them, they've now turned to this new method of lashing out against Western Europe and Russia and, in their mind, hopefully the United States, but without having a plan for finally bringing this to a conclusion. Is that a danger that you see?
I'm getting the microphone shoved this way, so I'll take a stab.
All the hard questions.
So I would say this, call it counterinsurgency, call it counterterrorism, it can only be as good as the government is supporting, and this really comes down to governance. I don't think that I don't know too many lately, but the typical Iraqi Sunni is really supportive of ISIS, but he looks or she looks to Baghdad and says, well, what do you got? What's the alternative? So I think we need to appreciate that any kind of security, any effort on the security side is got to be cognizant of the fact that it is only a complement to what needs to be an overarching political solution that can address the grievances of these individuals. I think to turn support away from ISIS, they need to have a better option within their own government, both in Syria and Iraq, for example. So I know that's just a portion of your question. But again, I think, when you're in the military, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But let's not forget that the military is just a tool, to really support what's got to be a political solution. We can't lose sight that this is about governance in the area.
Thank you. Morgan Kaplan. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow at CISAC. My question has to do with, to what extent we've seen progress at a societal level of how we intellectually register and respond to these events. I couldn't help but think, over the past few days as I was, reading my Facebook feed or Twitter and going on all the different websites, it seemed like for every kind of insensitive thing said or kind of poor responses we've seen to the attacks, there have been equally as many, if not more, really intelligent op-eds written kind of showing how much we understand terrorism now, how much we understand what groups like ISIS want to do. And I'm curious, just in the broader perspective, since 9/11, since then, are we getting better as, an intellectual community at responding to these sorts of things and especially projecting it societally?
Well, I think that at the level of sort of general sort of political elite sort of understanding, for example, that ISIS would like to provoke us into overreaction, that an immediate knee-jerk reaction to stop all refugees and all immigration. And by the way, the association between terrorism and immigration is quite old, at least in Europe. It's not just post-Paris. This has been going on for, as you all know, it's been a platform in the parties of the extreme right for quite some time. But if we just focus on the U.S., yes, I think we've developed a more sophisticated understanding at the levels of sort of a policy elite. Whether this extends to the general public or not, I really don't know. I find some of the politicians' claims about what would work and recommendations for what we should do quite disturbing. But again, I don't know any way to stop the politicization of the issue other than simply to resist it, and for those of us who do know something about it to continue to speak out, to write op-eds. But I was going to say give interviews to the media, but it's very time consuming to do this, and you don't know whether you're having an impact. I don't know whether there have been any quick public opinion polls or not to find out whether the public really is turning anti-refugee, anti-immigrant. I don't think there's any great public demand for ground troops. I just don't sense that at all in what I read. But I would want to look pretty closely at the polls to see whether the general public is also gaining a more sophisticated appreciation that an overreaction displays into their hands.
Chaim Braun from CISAC. I think Martha hit it in the last few comments about the Saudi teaching of Wahhabism, or Salafism really, and the large financing of proselytizing of their ideology in mosques all over Europe, all over the Middle East, and so on. It all starts with the madrasas rather than with the mosques. It started the madrasa and then proceeds to the mosques, where you got, in some cases, radical imams preaching jihadi ideology. And the question is it possible to change, through the Saudi government, for instance, the message that comes to the madrasas on the one hand, and on the other hand, now in the climate that we are, is it possible to curtail some of the activities of the more radical preachers in various mosques everywhere? An example, Abu Muqtada in Britain, whom you know the case.
There's been a lot of debate as to whether terrorist recruitment comes from madrasas, that is religious educational institutions, or not. There's certainly an association with some of the mosques. Although, as I understand it, what's happened is that as governments have started to pay more and more attention to what's going on in the mosques, the more radicalized individuals are moving away from the institution of the mosque into more private, hidden, clandestine forums where they can exchange their views, because they know that if governments know where the mosques are, they're under surveillance pretty tightly. Now, I'd say what I would take mostly from all the things she said, which are all very much to the point, I think the U.S. needs to put pressure on the Saudis and the other Sunni-led governments, monarchies, United Arab Emirates, other countries, to crack down on these groups. I don't think the Saudis are seeing ISIS or the al-Nusra Front or AQAP necessarily as their major threat right now. They're seeing Iran as their major threat, and they're focused on that. And I think that they could do more. And you also note in terms of past history that when these radical Sunni groups posed a threat to the kingdom itself, to Saudi Arabia, they cracked down on them in no short order. That was no problem, and they drove them out. And that's how we wound up largely with AQAP in Yemen, because it's formed from the remnant of a group that was active in Saudi Arabia. So if they want to, they could crush them. And yes, they could remove their support because somebody has to pay for this. There is money involved in it. I was even told in Mali, and I can't vouch for the truthfulness of this, but a Malian told me, so it certainly believed in Mali, that Saudis paid people, for example, they paid women to wear the veil, they paid people to wear Islamist garb. Again, I can't vouch myself for the truth of that, but it was certainly widely believed among other people in Mali that this was the case. And yes, the Saudis are our great ally, and I think we could put more pressure on them. Same with the Emiratis.
Do you want to add anything, Joe?
I quickly, Paul, and just the saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think an emphasis, I think your point, we need to be careful. Obviously, we have aligned interest with Iran right now in many respects, but we do need to be cautious of the effects that's going to have on our relationship with Saudi Arabia and other Sunni countries. And to your point, I remember just before 9/11 being in the southern Philippines and seeing a Saudi-supported charity down in an island called Basilan and reporting back on. I mean, Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, in fact, was there at the time, Jamal Khalifa, who you may be familiar with. But we got to hold countries accountable that are responsible somehow, and that's a very delicate balance to walk.
Dave Elliott, CISAC affiliate, on this idea that ISIS has a rather sophisticated view of exporting terrorism. I'd like to pursue that a little bit. Are you saying that you think that they look at take the U.S., that things would happen in the U.S. if we were attacked, as say as in Paris or 9/11, that things would be done in the United States that would, in the long run, strengthen ISIS or weaken the United States' resolve in being involved against them? Or is it just possible that if you look at their writings, they believe in revenge in a very big way, and these other things are kind of our calculations and inventions?
You want to take a stab at that? Then I'll
Okay.
try to.
Well, I mean, the U.S. and any country that's viewed as, again, to my earlier comments, I think ISIS is weak in Iraq and Syria. They're losing the fight, and they have a strong incentive to reach out and attack outside of the borders. So I think we'll see more of that. I don't question the U.S. resolve to continue to be a stalwart supporter of the fight against them. But other countries, their domestic constituencies, it remains to be seen. If they see a huge cost to supporting a coalition effort, they may weigh that and decide accordingly. I don't see it happening in the United States, but I certainly think it's a rational strategy for ISIS to attack outside its borders, given its current weakness within Iraq and Syria and its ability to mobilize and leverage these sleeper cells and these domestic terrorists and homegrown ISIS supporters.
It's a very big and important question, and I think I'll sort of take two sides of it. One, are they really being very strategic in trying to calculate the reaction of the target and think it through in terms of a logical progression of tit for tat, or are they just seeking revenge? And I think it's a combination, because I think that in terms of recruiting people actually to go out and do these things, to strap on the suicide belt and go blow themselves up in a cafe or at the entrance to a stadium or in a crowd in a market, outside a mosque or in a mosque or at a funeral, that exploiting those motivations of revenge is very strong. Revenge, humiliation, anger, simply getting even. So what we tend to think is that you have leaders who think very strategically, and then a lot of followers who are brought along through a more emotional sort of motivation. As far as how democracies will respond, would democracies cave in under this sort of pressure for fear of being more attacks at home, or will they only respond more strongly? Another one of our former fellows here, Max Abrams, has written on this, and it's about why democracies make superior counterterrorists. Because he argues that when you start attacking a country's civilian population, they don't give in. They don't actually simply subside. They are much more likely to be like the French and go out and bomb the first target they've got on their list. And there's likely to be a reaction that is actually going to hurt you. They're going to lash out at you. So the notion that democracies sort of crumble before a terrorist threat. And most people, you know, when the time of the Madrid bombings, I'm sure a lot of us remember that, and the argument was that, well, the Spanish government changed its stance. It affected the elections in Spain. Spain then withdrew from the coalition. And most studies have found that that's just not the way things happened at all, that the government lost credibility because it said that ETA was behind the Madrid bombings, which was just ridiculous on the face of it, frankly, and by lying to the public, and that they were already in trouble in the polls anyway, and the Spanish public had been against involvement with the coalition from the very beginning. So, by the way, for the record, of course, France was not with us in Iraq. They're with us now, but they weren't with us then, and still they got punished.
I'm Larry Brand, a visiting scholar at CISAC. I'd like to direct a question to Joe, because one of his comments made me a little concerned about what's playing out in Syria now. In fact, your comment was that the U.S. was the attribution for bad things happening in the theater was generally that the U.S. got blamed, whatever actor perpetrated the result. We've now got a situation in Syria in which many people are responding to various forces, including the Kurds, of course, the Russians, the French. Some of these respondees are probably not as concerned about collateral damage as the U.S. military is. Do you think this will still be a problem in Syria? If so, it appears that the U.S. military certainly has little ability to control the response and may in fact be at the blame end of all the perhaps many bad things that will occur.
No, Larry, I think you're exactly right. And again, my experience is certainly in Afghanistan, maybe less so in Iraq because I had a different mission there. When it's a U.S.-led coalition, you know, if you lose a loved one, you know, if you're on the receiving end of it, you blame the U.S. I recall that maybe Afghanistan isn't a perfect analogy, but you know, if one of our coalition forces had a civilian casualty event, it was absolutely blamed on, you know, they don't see British, Canadian, Italian, German, they see U.S. And you raise a great point, and this needs to inform, you know, our decisions going forward there. Even though we have a little plug for the U.S. military, very, very professional military that it's very much emphasizes, you know, reducing civilian casualties. We take the blame, if you will, for everything that happens. When I say on our watch, I don't mean to sound too pretentious, but a U.S.-led coalition is exactly that, and we will take the blame. So that is something that we need to be concerned about, because a lot of these forces that we may be working with are much less able, less trained, and we'll see some more collateral damage than we would be comfortable with. So it's yet another risk to factor in these very difficult decisions we have to make going forward.
Philippe Lebillon at Berkeley. I wanted to draw a little bit of a parallel, going back in time a little bit more with Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. Here we also had a military movement emerging out of a decade and a half, even more, 62, of war, with heavy involvement both by the French and the Americans. And we saw the end of it coming essentially from Khmer Rouge attacks on Vietnam, and the two, like with Turkey and ISIS, are kind of Sunni. So for me, I'm looking at the dynamics of the regions, and often when friends ask me, I say, well, unless the Turks go for it, it's going to be very hard. A little bit like with Lebanon, we saw with Syria and the role it played after the civil war there. So I just was interested to get your point of view as American scholars on the position of Turkey in this respect, and whether the type of attack we saw recently against the left and the PKK, which was very directed at the enemies of Erdogan, if a similar attack was taking place against his supporters, whether we would possibly see a reaction by Turkey, which would bring this to an end, with probably a big thank you from the international community to Turkey at the end. Thank you very much.
I'm waiting to see where she pushed
I'll take a stab at that. I think that, first of all, that the Turkish regime has moved more and more toward, I think I would call it the right and a more Islamist sort of point of view, and a more authoritarian regime, less democratic than it was. And I think also that another unfortunate shift there is toward renewed hostilities with the Kurds and less tolerance for some sort of Kurdish, at least expression of cultural autonomy. Both of these things are going on. So I think the Turks are not very worried about ISIS. And you might say, well, but they've had attacks on their own soil. I think all that's kind of ambiguous, frankly. I'm not a conspiratorial sort of thinker, but I'm not sure exactly what was going on there. I think it's rather mysterious as to who was actually responsible for some of these bombings. And so I think all the Erdogan government is caring about now is keeping itself in power and crushing the Kurds. And this is what they're worried about. And I don't know whether we could put more pressure on them or not. So far, we've gotten them to let us use in Cyrillic. That was a step forward. There's a lot of pressure on them because, of course, this is the way people are getting into and out of Syria in many cases. Whether we'll be successful at putting pressure on them or not, I don't know. And I'll just return to something that Joe said. I'm totally in favor of our agreement with Iran, but the fact that we have the agreement with Iran makes it harder for us to put pressure on the Saudis and other Sunni governments who are very anti-Iran. And that's just one of the consequences that we're going to have to deal with. But I think you're quite right. It needs to be regional powers to step in here, and particularly other Sunni powers who should be able to step in and who could be doing much more than they are.
Just a quick one. As a Stanford-trained international relations, I'll say scholar, just states acting their interests, and I think the United States, we need to very much appreciate Turkey's interests, territorial integrity. Sometimes they overlap with ours, but we can't expect them to in all cases. And I think sometimes we assume a certain congruence of interest that just isn't there, and that's to our peril.
We have a congruence of interest in thanking Joe Felter and Martha Crenshaw for a terrific seminar.